Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome back to Stanley Flat Again. We're going to pick up with Chapter 5, Why Me? Stanley had looked sad all evening, Arthur thought. At bedtime, as they lay waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop to come say goodnight, he wondered how to cheer his brother up. It was raining hard, and he remembered suddenly the rainy evening that Stanley had snacked on raisins, and by the morning had become invisible. A little-known consequence, Dr. Dan had explained, of eating fruit during bad weather. "Hear the rain, Stanley?" he said. "Better not eat any fruit." "Ha, ha, ha," Stanley sounded cross. "Just leave me alone, okay?" "Stanley's in a terrible mood," Arthur told Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop when they came in. "He won't even talk to me." "What's wrong, my boy?" Mr. Lambchop asked. "Nothing." Stanley put his pillow over his head. "If my picture were in the newspaper practically every day, I'd be happy," Arthur said. "I mean, why—" Mrs. Lambchop hushed him. "Stanley, dear, what is troubling you?" Nothing, Stanley said from underneath the pillow and sat up. "But why me? Why am I always getting flat or invisible or something? Why can't it just once be someone else?" "I wouldn't mind, actually," Arthur said. "Just for a while, Hush, Arthur!" Mrs. Lambchop put out the overhead light, lit a corner lamp, and sat by Stanley on his bed. Mr. Lambchop sat with Arthur, and the gentle patter of the rain against the window, the glow of the little lamp, made the bedroom cozy indeed. "I do see what you mean, Stanley," Mr. Lambchop said at last. "Why do these things happen to you? Your mother and I don't know the answer either. But things often happen without there seeming to be a reason. And then something else happens, and suddenly the first thing seems to have had a purpose after all." "Well put, George," Mrs. Lambchop squeezed Stanley's hand. "What we do know, Stanley dear, is that we're very proud of you and love you very much, and we understand about the flatness and all the other unexpected happenings. How upsetting it must be." "It sure is," said Stanley. "How would you like never knowing when you might get flat? Or invisible? Maybe someday I'll wake up 10 feet tall, or 1 inch short, or with green hair, or a tail or something." "I know," Mrs. Lambchop said softly, and Mr. Lambchop came and patted Stanley's shoulder. Then they kissed both boys, switched off the lamp, and went out. Arthur spoke into the darkened room. "Stanley?" "I'm trying to sleep," Stanley said. "What?" "I was just thinking," Arthur said. "If you got invisible, and then you got flat, how would they know?" "Huh? I don't—" Stanley laughed. "Oh, I get it. About the flatness. Good one, Arthur." Arthur laughed too. "Quiet, please," Stanley said. "I'm trying to sleep." "Okay," Arthur said, but he chuckled several times before he fell asleep. Chapter 6, Emma. Mr. Lambchop came home early the next afternoon, full of excitement. "Guess what?" he said. "The old Merkur department store downtown? 8 floors all emptied out, waiting to be torn down? Well, last night, most of it fell down by itself." He switched on the TV. "News time. Let's get the latest." "More on the Merkur building collapse," a newscaster was saying. "It's just a mountain of rubble now, folks. 3 workmen had been treated for minor bruises, but no other injuries are reported. The public is requested to avoid the area until—" A young woman ran on, handing him a slip of paper, and ran off again. "Hold on, this just in," the newscaster read from the slip of paper. "Wow, a little girl is trapped under all that wreckage. Emma Weeks, daughter of local businessman Oswald Weeks." "Emma Weeks!" Stanley exclaimed. "She's in my class. No wonder she wasn't at school today." "Emma's not hurt, it appears," the newscaster continued. "Firemen called to the scene can hear her calling up through the chinks in the wreckage, demanding food and water. But Fire Chief Johnson had forbidden any rescue efforts. Any disturbances, any shifting of the wreckage, he says, might bring the rest of the building crashing down. Now here's Tom Miller. The TV screen showed a reporter with a microphone standing by the wreckage building. "Emma Weeks," shouted the reporter, holding the microphone up to the wreckage. "Do you hear me? Are you all right?" Emma's voice was faint but clear. "Oh, sure. I'm just great. I hope a building falls on me every day, you know. Come on, get me out of here." Mrs. Lambchop sighed. Such an unfortunate tone. She is under great strain, of course. "Emma's always like that," Stanley said. Half an hour later, while Mrs. Lambchop was preparing supper, a siren sound outside and then died away. Opening the front door, Mr. Lambchop saw a fire department car at the curb. On the doorstep stood Fire Chief Johnson and a very worried-looking man and woman. "Mr. Lambchop," said Chief Johnson. "I'll get right to the point, sir. I reckon you heard about little Emma Weeks trapped in the Merkur wreckage." "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Weeks here, and me, we'd like a word with you folks." Of course, Mr. Lambchop led the visitors into the house and introduced them to his family. "Oh, Mrs. Weeks," Mrs. Lambchop cried, "your poor daughter, you must be dreadfully worried." "We are indeed," said Mr. Weeks, "but Chief Johnson thinks your Stanley might be able to help save Emma." "Who, me? And who, Stanley?" said Stanley and Arthur. Chief Johnson explained. "Problem is that if a policeman or one of my firemen tries to dig his way to Emma, the whole rest of the building could crash down on him. Too bad we don't have a flat fireman, I was thinking. Flat fella could squeeze through all those narrow openings we know are there, because we hear Emma when she calls." Then I recollected the newspaper story with a picture of Stanley here. Hit me right away. That boy could maybe wiggle to Emma. For a moment, everyone was silent. Then Mrs. Lambchop shook her head. "It sounds terribly dangerous," she said. "I'm sorry, but I must say no." "It is a tad risky, ma'am," said Chief Johnson. "But we've got to remember that the boy is already flat." Mrs. Weeks sobbed. "Oh, poor Emma. How are we to save her?" Mr. Lambchop bit his lip. Mrs. Lambchop bit her lip. Stanley remembered something. "I was just thinking." He turned to Mr. Lambchop. "The other night, when I got mad about all the crazy things that kept happening to me, remember what you said? You said that sometimes things happen that nobody can see for a reason, and then afterwards, some of the things happen." I'm going to start that sentence. I'm going to start that whole page again. "The other night, when I got mad about all the crazy things that keep happening to me, remember what you said? You said that sometimes things happen that nobody can see a reason for. And then afterwards, some other thing happens. And all of a sudden, it seems like the first thing had a reason after all. Well, I was just thinking that me getting flat again was one crazy thing. And that maybe Emma getting stuck where I'm the only one who can try to save her, that might be the second thing." Mr. Lambchop nodded and took Mrs. Lambchop's hand. "We should be very proud of our son, Harriet." Mrs. Lambchop thought for a moment. "Stanley," she said at last, "will you be very, very careful not to let that enormous building fall on you?" "Okay, sure," said Stanley. Mrs. Lambchop turned to Mr. and Mrs. Weeks. "We will allow Stanley to help," she said. "He will do his best for Emma." "Fine boy we got here, brave as a lion," shouted Chief Johnson. "Now listen up, folks. Mrs. Lambchop, you help me get things ready. Then Stanley can go right in after Emma. Got that? Everybody meet up at the Merkur building, 30 minutes from now." It's the end of chapter 6. Next week, we will finish the book. Stay safe, everyone.